The coffee shop buzzed with the usual afternoon crowd. Students hunched over laptops, the hiss of the espresso machine punctuating conversations, and the warm smell of freshly baked cookies filling the air. It was just another Tuesday for Jake Henderson as he pushed through the door, his backpack slung carelessly over one shoulder. Jake was the kind of guy everyone knew on campus, not because he was famous or anything, but because he made sure of it. With his easy smile and the way he could talk to anyone about anything for exactly as long as it interested him, Jake had built quite a reputation. He played on the intramural soccer team, knew the best parties, and never seemed to worry about tomorrow. His friends called him the charmer, though not always as a compliment. Today, Jake was running late for his study group. He'd overslept after staying up too late playing video games. Now he needed caffeine badly. As he waited in line, drumming his fingers against his thigh, his eyes wandered around the shop, something they did often. That's when he saw her. She sat alone at a corner table, completely focused on her book. Her straight black hair fell forward as she leaned in, hiding part of her face. A half-empty cup of tea sat forgotten beside her notebook, which was filled with the neatest handwriting Jake had ever seen. Without even thinking about it, Jake found himself watching how she tucked her hair behind her ear, revealing a small smile as she read something that apparently pleased her. "Can I help you?" the barista asked, pulling Jake back to reality. After getting his coffee, Jake should have headed straight to his study group. He knew they were waiting, but instead, he found himself walking toward the girls' table, coffee in hand and confidence in his step. "That book must be really good," he said, stopping beside her table. "You haven't looked up once in the last 5 minutes." The girl did look up then, her dark eyes showing surprise, then a hint of amusement. "Were you watching me for 5 minutes?" Jake felt his cheeks warm slightly. Not many people could make him feel caught off guard. "I wouldn't call it watching. More like appreciating the view while waiting for my order." She closed her book, keeping one finger inside to mark her place. "That's a smooth recovery," she said, her voice quiet but firm. There was something different about her. She seemed to be really looking at him, not just seeing his smile or responding to his charm. "I'm Jake," he said, extending his hand. "Mind if I join you for a minute?" She hesitated, her eyes taking in details about him that made Jake feel oddly exposed. Then she nodded. "I'm Melissa Chen. And sure, but just for a minute. I have a biochem exam to study for." Jake sat down, putting his coffee on the table. "Biochem? You must be smart." "Or just hardworking," Melissa replied with a small shrug. "Not everything comes naturally to everyone." Their conversation flowed more easily than Jake expected. Usually he had to work harder to keep a girl's attention, but Melissa asked questions that showed she was actually listening. She didn't laugh too loudly at his jokes or try to impress him. In fact, it felt like she was quietly assessing him. After 15 minutes, much longer than the minute he'd asked for, Jake realized he was now extremely late for his study group, but he didn't want to leave. "I should probably let you get back to studying," he said finally, though he made no move to stand up. Melissa nodded, opening her book again. "It was nice meeting you, Jake." "Could I get your number?" he asked, phone already in hand. "Maybe we could grab coffee when you're not studying for biochem." She looked at him for a long moment, and Jake had the strangest feeling she was seeing right through him, past all his charm and easy confidence. Finally, she took his phone and typed in her number. "I'm free on Thursday afternoon," she said, handing it back. As Jake finally headed to his very delayed study group, he smiled to himself. Just another girl to add to his list, he thought. Cute, smart, a little mysterious. Nothing he couldn't handle. He had no idea that Melissa Chen was about to change everything he thought he knew about himself. The next few weeks went by in a blur of coffee dates and text messages. Jake found himself looking forward to seeing Melissa more than he expected. There was something different about her. The way she listened when he talked, really listened, instead of just waiting for her turn to speak. "So you grew up moving around a lot?" Melissa asked one afternoon as they sat on a bench near the campus lake. She wore a simple blue sweater that made her eyes seem even darker, more thoughtful. "Yeah, my dad's job. New city every couple years," Jake said, tossing a piece of his sandwich to a hopeful duck. "Got pretty good at making friends fast, not getting too attached to places." "Or people?" Melissa added quietly. Jake glanced at her, surprised by how quickly she'd connected those dots. I guess so. Never really thought about it that way. This was their third meetup that week, which was unusual for Jake. Normally, he'd space things out, keep his options open. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably Zoe from his economics class asking if he was going to the party tonight. He ignored it. "What about you?" Jake asked, genuinely curious. "You don't talk much about your family." Melissa smiled slightly. "Not much to tell. Dad works for the government. Mom teaches piano. I've got an older brother who's studying law." "Government job, huh? Like pushing papers at the DMV," Jake joked. "Something like that," Melissa replied, her eyes following a jogger across the park. Jake had noticed she did that, watched people, noticed details. He works long hours, very dedicated to what he does. Jake nodded but didn't push for more. Instead, he suggested they grab ice cream before his afternoon class. As they walked, he casually put his arm around her shoulders. Melissa didn't pull away, but he could feel a certain reserve in how she leaned into him, like she was keeping part of herself carefully protected. Days turned into weeks. Jake introduced Melissa to his friends at a small party at his apartment. She fit in well enough, chatting with his roommate's girlfriend about a TV show they both watched, but she nursed the same drink all night and slipped away early, saying she had morning plans. "She's different from your usual type," his roommate commented after she left. "What's that supposed to mean?" Jake asked, a bit defensively. His roommate shrugged, "Just saying, she seems, I don't know, like she's got her act together, not just looking for a good time." Jake brushed it off, but the comment stuck with him. It was true that Melissa wasn't like the other girls he typically dated. She didn't get jealous when he talked to other women. She didn't text him constantly or try to pin down what they were. There was an independence about her that both attracted and unnerved him. On a rainy Tuesday night, Melissa called to cancel their movie plans. "Family dinner," she explained. "Dad's home early for once." "No problem," Jake said easily. "Tomorrow instead?" "Sure," she replied. "Jake, can I ask you something?" "Shoot. What exactly are we doing here, you and me?" The question caught him off guard. "Hanging out. Having fun?" he offered lamely. Melissa was quiet for a moment. "Right, that's what I figured." She didn't sound upset, just confirming something she already knew. The following Friday, Jake made dinner reservations at a new restaurant downtown that Melissa had mentioned wanting to try. It was more effort than he usually put in, and he wasn't sure why he was doing it. But a few hours before they were supposed to meet, his buddy Trent called about last-minute tickets to the basketball game. Front row seats. Jake stared at his phone, Melissa's contact info open, his thumb hovering over the call button. After a moment's hesitation, he sent a quick text instead. Something came up. "Rain check on dinner?" He turned his phone to silent and slipped it into his pocket. It was just one dinner, he told himself. Not a big deal. They weren't exclusive or anything. What Jake didn't know was that Melissa sat alone at that restaurant table for nearly an hour before giving up. And as she walked home in the cool evening air, she wasn't surprised or even particularly hurt. She'd seen this coming, had been watching for the signs all along. Her father hadn't raised her to miss the details after all. Jake checked his reflection in the car mirror one last time before getting out. He'd actually ironed his shirt for this dinner, something he hadn't done since his cousin's wedding last year. He wasn't sure why he felt so nervous. It was just dinner with Melissa's family. No big deal. Yet as he walked up the neatly kept pathway to the ordinary-looking suburban house, his stomach twisted in knots. After standing Melissa up at the restaurant last week, he'd been surprised when she still talked to him. Even more surprised when she invited him to Sunday dinner with her family. "They want to meet you," she'd said with a look he couldn't quite read. "Especially my dad." Jake rang the doorbell, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He brought a bottle of wine, not too expensive, but not cheap either. His mom had always taught him never to show up empty-handed. The door opened, and Jake plastered on his most charming smile, ready to meet Melissa's mom. Instead, he found himself looking at a man in his early 50s with short-cropped salt and pepper hair and the most piercing eyes Jake had ever seen. "You must be Jake," the man said, his voice calm and measured. "I'm Robert Chen, Melissa's father." Jake swallowed hard. "Nice to meet you, sir." He extended his hand, which Mr. Chen shook firmly. Those eyes seemed to be taking in every detail about Jake, from his slightly scuffed shoes to the nervous smile on his face. "Please come in," Mr. Chen said, stepping aside. "Melissa's helping her mother in the kitchen." The house was warm and filled with delicious smells. Family photos lined the hallway, Melissa as a little girl holding a science fair trophy, a graduation, family vacations. It looked like a normal, happy family home. "So," Mr. Chen said as he led Jake to the living room, "Melissa tells me you're studying business." "Yes, sir. Marketing with a minor in communications." Mr. Chen nodded, gesturing for Jake to take a seat on the couch. "And what do you plan to do with that degree?" The question was simple enough, but something in Mr. Chen's tone made Jake feel like this was a test. Before he could answer, Melissa appeared in the doorway, her face lighting up when she saw him. "Jake, you made it," she said, coming over to give him a quick hug. She was wearing a simple blue dress that made her look different somehow, more grown-up than the college student he knew. "Hi," Jake said, feeling strangely shy. "I brought wine." Mrs. Chen appeared next, a warm smile on her face as she wiped her hands on her apron. She was shorter than Melissa, with the same dark eyes but laugh lines around them. "So this is the famous Jake we've been hearing about," she said, shaking his hand. "Dinner's almost ready. I hope you like lasagna." The four of them moved to the dining room, where a table was set with actual cloth napkins and what looked like real silver. Jake tried to remember which fork to use first as they all sat down. Mr. Chen took the head of the table, Mrs. Chen to his right, Melissa to his left, and Jake beside Melissa. The first few minutes were filled with normal dinner conversation. Mrs. Chen asked about classes, Jake complimented the food, and Melissa talked about a project she was working on. Everything seemed to be going well. Then Mr. Chen put down his fork. "So Jake," he said casually, "what happened last Friday night? Melissa mentioned you had reservations at Bella Not." Jake nearly choked on his water. He glanced at Melissa, who was suddenly very interested in her salad. Something came up," Jake stammered. "Last-minute thing." "Must have been important," Mr. Chen said, his eyes never leaving Jake's face. "Bella Notte is hard to get into, especially on Fridays." Jake nodded, feeling sweat forming on his forehead. "Basketball game. Front row seats. My buddy called last minute with tickets." "I see," Mr. Chen said, taking a sip of his water. "You know, in my line of work, I've learned that priorities reveal a lot about a person's character." "Dad," Melissa said quietly, "what exactly is your line of work? You never told Jake." Mr. Chen smiled slightly. "Didn't I? I'm with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Behavioral Analysis Unit." Jake's stomach dropped. FBI. Behavioral analysis? He suddenly felt like he was sitting across from an X-ray machine instead of a person. "That's interesting," Jake managed to say. "Must be exciting work." "Oh, it has its moments," Mr. Chen replied. "But mostly, it's about paying attention to the details people think no one notices." As Mr. Chen reached for the breadbasket, Jake caught Melissa's eye. She gave him a small, almost apologetic smile. And suddenly, Jake understood that this dinner was not going to be the simple meet the parents' evening he had expected. This was something else entirely. The lasagna was delicious, but Jake could barely taste it. His mind was racing. FBI. Behavioral analysis. His fork felt heavy in his hand as he tried to act normal. Mrs. Chen passed him the garlic bread, offering a warm smile that didn't quite ease his nerves. "So Jake," Mr. Chen said, dabbing his mouth with his napkin, "Melissa tells me you're quite popular on campus, involved in a lot of activities." Jake nodded, trying to sound confident. "I play intramural soccer, and I'm in the marketing club." "And quite the social butterfly from what I hear," Mr. Chen added, his eyes twinkling with something that wasn't quite amusement. "Lots of friends, parties, that sort of thing." Jake glanced at Melissa, wondering exactly what she told her father. "I like to have fun," he admitted. "College is about more than just classes, right?" "Absolutely," Mr. Chen agreed. "It's about building relationships, learning who you can trust." He took a sip of water. "Tell me about last weekend. I believe there was a lake house party." Jake's stomach clenched. How did he know about that? "Yeah, my buddy Tyler's parents own a place at the lake, just a small get-together." "Interesting," Mr. Chen said, cutting his lasagna with careful precision. From the photos I saw, it looked quite lively. Photos? Jake's mind raced. He hadn't posted any pictures. Unless he glanced at his phone, sitting on the table beside his plate. Had Mr. Chen somehow accessed his photos? Could FBI agents do that? Speaking of photos, Mrs. Chen chimed in. Melissa showed us that nice picture of you two at the coffee shop. The one your friend took. Jake breathed a small sigh of relief. Of course. Social media. Nothing sinister. Melissa mentioned you consider yourselves exclusive. Mr. Chen continued casually. Is that right? The question caught Jake off guard. He and Melissa had never actually had that conversation. He looked at her, but her expression was unreadable. We haven't really put a label on things, Jake said carefully. No labels. Mr. Chen nodded, very modern. Though I noticed you were quite friendly with a young lady at that lake house party. Long blonde hair, blue tank top. Jake nearly choked on his water. How could he possibly know that? He had chatted with a girl named Caitlin, maybe flirted a little, but nothing serious. And there definitely weren't any photos of that. Just a classmate, Jake managed to say. We were talking about a group project. Mr. Chen said, his expression unchanged. Must have been quite the project. Very hands-on from what I observed. Jake felt his face grow hot. He hadn't done anything wrong exactly, but he suddenly felt like he'd been caught in a lie. Which was ridiculous because there was no way Mr. Chen could have seen him at that party. Was there? Dad, Melissa said quietly, are you trying to scare Jake? Mr. Chen smiled slightly. Not at all, sweetheart, just getting to know him better. He turned back to Jake. You know what I find fascinating about human behavior? People think they're so unpredictable, but most of us follow patterns. For instance, someone who stands up a date once is likely to do it again. Jake felt a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. I already apologized for that, he said, struggling to keep his voice steady. Words are easy, Mr. Chen replied. Actions tell the real story. Did you know that in my line of work, I can tell when someone's being dishonest just by watching their expressions? The slight twitch of an eye, the way they hold their fork, even how they breathe. Jake set down his fork, suddenly self-conscious about every move he made. Was he breathing normally? He couldn't tell anymore. Robert, Mrs. Chen said gently. Maybe we could talk about something else. Jake, did Melissa tell you I teach piano? Jake gratefully seized the new topic. No, she didn't. That's really cool. How long have you been teaching? But even as the conversation shifted, Jake could feel Mr. Chen watching him. Not glaring or being hostile, just observing. Taking in every detail, every reaction, every word. Dessert came. Homemade apple pie that would have been amazing under different circumstances. As Mrs. Chen served the slices, Mr. Chen casually mentioned, You know, Jake, I've always believed that character is revealed in the small choices we make when we think no one important is watching. Jake's spoon clattered against his plate. He looked up to find Mr. Chen's eyes locked on his. Those weren't the eyes of an angry father. They were something much worse, the eyes of someone who could see right through him. And someone, Mr. Chen said softly, is always watching. After the most uncomfortable dessert of his life, Jake hoped they'd all move to the living room. Instead, Mr. Chen stood up and gave him a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Jake, why don't we step into my office for a minute? I'd like to show you something. It wasn't really a question. Melissa shot Jake a look that might have been sympathy as her mother began clearing the plates. Sure, Jake said, trying to sound casual despite the knot in his stomach. He followed Mr. Chen down a short hallway to a room at the back of the house. The office was neat and organized, a desk with a computer, bookshelves filled with thick volumes on psychology and criminology, and a few framed family photos. Nothing scary. No interrogation lights or two-way mirrors like in the movies. Somehow, that made it worse. Have a seat, Mr. Chen said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. He closed the door with a soft click that sounded oddly final. Jake sat down, fighting the urge to wipe his sweaty palms on his pants. Mr. Chen didn't sit behind the desk like Jake expected. Instead, he pulled another chair around so they were sitting face to face, nothing between them. Relax, Jake, Mr. Chen said, his voice surprisingly gentle. I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to talk. About Melissa? Jake asked, his voice cracking slightly. About you, actually. Mr. Chen leaned back in his chair. Do you know what I do in the FBI, Jake? Jake shook his head. I study patterns, human behavior. I spent 25 years learning to read people who don't want to be read. He folded his hands in his lap. It's not about lie detectors or tough interrogations. It's about paying attention to the small things most people miss. Jake swallowed hard. Sir, if this is about me canceling on Melissa. This isn't about one dinner, Mr. Chen cut in. It's about patterns of behavior. It's about integrity. Do you know what that word means, Jake? Really means? Doing the right thing, Jake offered weakly. Close. It's about being the same person in all situations. The same person when you're with Melissa as you are when you're with your friends. The same person online as you are in person. Mr. Chen's eyes never left Jake's face. It's about being honest even when no one's watching. Jake felt uncomfortably exposed, like Mr. Chen could somehow see every text he'd ever sent, every promise he'd broken. I'm not sure what you're getting at, sir. Mr. Chen smiled slightly. Let me tell you what I see when I look at you, Jake. I see a young man who's learned to charm his way through life. Good-looking, smart enough, athletic enough. Things have probably come easily to you. You've never had to work too hard for people to like you. Jake wanted to object, but the words stuck in his throat because, well, it was true. I also see someone who keeps people at arm's length, Mr. Chen continued. You're friendly with everyone but close to very few. You make plans but break them if something better comes along. You flirt with other girls even while dating my daughter. I never, Jake started. The lake house, Mr. Chen said quietly. The blonde. Her name is Caitlin, and yes, I know exactly what happened. Jake felt his face go hot. How could you possibly know that? It doesn't matter how I know. What matters is that you did it. Mr. Chen leaned forward slightly. You're living without integrity, Jake, and the problem with that is eventually it catches up to you. The room was silent for a moment. Jake felt something strange happening inside him, a mix of shame and anger and, oddly, relief. No one had ever called him out so completely before. I'm not a bad person, Jake said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. No, you're not, Mr. Chen agreed, surprising him. Bad people don't usually care if they're bad. You care, I can see that. But you've been living carelessly, without thinking about how your actions affect others. He reached over and picked up a photo from his desk, a younger version of himself with Mrs. Chen and a small Melissa missing her front teeth. When you have a daughter, you see the world differently. You notice the Jakes of the world. You worry about them. For the first time that evening, Jake saw real emotion in Mr. Chen's eyes, not anger or suspicion, but genuine concern. I'm not trying to scare you off, Mr. Chen said. I'm trying to hold up a mirror. What you see in it, and what you do about it, that's entirely up to you. Jake looked down at his hands. The strange thing was, for the first time in a long time, he was seeing himself clearly, and he wasn't sure he liked what he saw. Jake didn't remember the drive back to his apartment. His hands moved the steering wheel, his foot pressed the pedals, but his mind was somewhere else entirely, stuck in that small office with Mr. Chen's words echoing in his head. Living without integrity. The phrase followed him up the stairs to his apartment. He fumbled with his keys, dropping them twice before finally getting the door open. His roommate looked up from the couch. Hey man, how'd the big dinner go? Did her dad hate you? He laughed, expecting some funny story. I don't want to talk about it, Jake mumbled, heading straight for his bedroom. He'd flopped onto his bed, staring at the ceiling. How had Mr. Chen known about Caitlin at the lake house? About the texts he'd sent to other girls? About all of it? Part of him wanted to be angry. Who did this guy think he was, digging into his personal life? But a quieter voice inside reminded him that Mr. Chen hadn't actually done anything wrong. He'd just held up a mirror. The ugly truth was already there. Jake's phone buzzed. A text from Melissa, you okay? Sorry about my dad. He stared at the message, unsure how to respond. Was he okay? He didn't feel okay. He felt like someone had turned on a light in a dark room, exposing all the mess he'd been ignoring. Fine, he finally wrote back, just tired. 3 dots appeared as she typed, then disappeared. A minute later, he means well. Talk tomorrow? Jake set his phone down without answering. He didn't know what to say to her now. Had she known what her father was planning? Had this whole thing been a setup? Sleep didn't come easily that night. Jake tossed and turned, replaying moments from the past few months. The time he told Melissa he was studying at the library but went to a party instead. The flirty texts with Caitlin. The casual lies he told so often he barely noticed them anymore. Morning came with no answers, just a headache and the same uncomfortable feeling in his chest. For the next few days, Jake moved through his classes like a zombie. He turned down invitations to hang out, ignored texts from some of the girls he'd been stringing along. When he spotted Caitlin across the quad, he quickly changed direction, avoiding eye contact. On Wednesday afternoon, his phone rang, his mom calling for their weekly chat. "How's my favorite son?" she asked cheerfully. "I'm your only son, Mom," he replied, the familiar joke fallen flat. "Everything okay, honey? You sound down." Jake hesitated. "Mom, do you think I'm a good person?" The question hung in the air for a moment. "Of course you are," she said finally. "Why would you ask that?" He sank onto a bench, watching students walk by. "Just something someone said made me think." "Is this about a girl?" His mom had always been perceptive. "Sort of. Her dad, actually. He's FBI, and he basically called me out for being, I don't know, fake. Living without integrity." His mom was quiet for a moment. "That sounds harsh." "Yeah, but," Jake sighed. "The thing is, Mom, I think he might be right." They talked for nearly an hour, Jake opening up in a way he hadn't since he was a kid. His mom listened, asked questions, didn't judge. By the time they hung up, the knot in his chest had loosened slightly. That evening, Jake was walking through campus when he spotted a girl from his economics class heading his way. Petite, curly hair, cute smile. She'd been dropping hints for weeks that she was interested. The old Jake would have turned on the charm instantly. Instead, he gave her a polite nod and kept walking. Back at his apartment, Jake pulled out his phone and scrolled to Melissa's number. He hadn't talked to her since the dinner disaster 5 days ago. His thumb hovered over her name. What would he even say? "Sorry your dad exposed me as a fake." "Sorry I've been treating you like just another girl when you're clearly not." He put the phone down and grabbed his laptop instead. Opening a new document, he began to type. "Things I need to change." As the list grew longer, something strange happened. Instead of feeling worse, Jake felt a spark of something that might have been hope. Maybe Mr. Chen had done him a favor. Maybe being seen, really seen, flaws and all, was the first step toward becoming someone better. Someone with integrity. Jake reached for his phone again. This time, he didn't hesitate. "Melissa," he typed. "Can we talk?" For real this time, 6 months could change a lot about a person. Jake stood in front of the mirror, straightening his tie, an actual tie, not something he would have bothered with before. His roommate walked past the open bathroom door and did a double take. "Dude, again with the dress clothes? Who died?" Jake smiled. "Just dinner with Melissa's family." "Man, her FBI dad really did a number on you," his roommate said, shaking his head. "You used to be fun." The old Jake might have felt stunned by that comment. The new Jake just shrugged. "Still am. Just different fun." The drive to the Chen house felt different this time. No sweaty palms, no rehearsed lines, no strategies for charming the parents. Just Jake showing up as himself. Mrs. Chen answered the door, welcoming him with a warm hug. "Jake, come in. Dinner's almost ready." Inside, Melissa was setting the table. When she saw him, her face lit up in a way that still made his heart skip. She crossed the room and kissed him lightly. "Right on time," she said with a smile that held meaning only the two of them understood. Being on time was one of those small things that had become important to Jake. Keeping his word, following through. Little pieces of integrity that added up to something bigger. Mr. Chen appeared from his office, extending his hand. "Jake, good to see you." Their handshake felt different now, equal somehow. Not quite friends, but something built on mutual respect. "How's the internship going?" Mr. Chen asked as they moved to the dining room. Jake had landed a position at a non-profit that helped kids from low-income families prepare for college. Not the flashy marketing job he'd once imagined for himself, but work that felt meaningful. "Really good," Jake said. "We just got a grant to expand the mentorship program." Dinner was relaxed, nothing like that first interrogation. They talked about Melissa's graduate school applications, Mrs. Chen's piano students, even politics without anyone getting upset. Normal family stuff. After dessert, Mr. Chen invited Jake outside to the back porch. Jake followed, remembering how terrified he'd been of these one-on-one conversations before. They stood side by side, looking out at the darkening yard. Crickets chirped in the warm evening air. "You've changed," Mr. Chen said simply. Jake nodded. "I'm trying. It's not easy, you know. Most people don't. Change, that is." Mr. Chen took a sip from his coffee mug. "May I ask why you decided to?" Jake thought about it. "That night, when you called me out, nobody had ever really seen me before. Not the real me. It was scary, but also, I don't know. It felt like a chance to be better." Mr. Chen nodded. "Most of my work involves people who've gone down the wrong path too far to turn back. It's refreshing to see someone choose differently." Inside, they could hear Melissa laughing at something her mother said. The sound made Jake smile. "I think I love her," he said suddenly, surprised by his own words. Mr. Chen raised an eyebrow. "You think?" "I know I do," Jake corrected himself. "But I'm not rushing anything. We're taking it slow, doing it right." Mr. Chen studied him for a moment. "You know what's interesting about behavior analysis, Jake? We can predict what people will do based on patterns. 6 months ago, your patterns suggested someone who wouldn't stick around when things got difficult." He turned to face Jake fully. "Your patterns have changed." Coming from Mr. Chen, this was high praise. Jake felt something settle in his chest, a quiet pride that felt different from the hollow confidence he'd once had. Later that night, as Jake and Melissa walked hand in hand under the stars, she bumped his shoulder playfully. "Remember when you thought I was just another girl you could charm?" she teased. Jake laughed. "Biggest mistake of my life. Your dad made sure I knew it too." "He's good at that," she admitted. "Too good sometimes. But he was right about you." "That I was a jerk?" "No," Melissa said, stopping to face him. "That you could be better. He saw something in you worth challenging." Jake pulled her close, thinking about how different his life would have been if he'd stuck to his old patterns, the surface-level connections, the casual dishonesty, the person he was becoming before Mr. Chen held up that mirror. "You know what's funny?" Jake said softly. "I thought your dad was teaching me how to date his daughter properly. But he was actually teaching me how to be the person I really wanted to be all along." Melissa smiled up at him. "That's usually how the best lessons work." And as they continued their walk under the night sky, Jake realized that what had started as the most terrifying dinner of his life had become the most important one. The night someone had cared enough to show him the truth about himself and given him the chance to change his story.